Presented exclusively by Mother's Polish.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a Mercedes is Back edition of the Slipstream, an F1 podcast hosted by me, Brady. And as always, joining me in the Slipstream tonight with their DRS wings wide open are my boys, Matthew and Cole Trickle Jr. We're missing Sten tonight. He's actually down in Miami doing hot laps, I think, in a Tahoe around the Miami circuit. So miss him tonight. Fortunate for him, he won't be able to stand up for Red Bull, which we'll get into here in a little bit. For this week's episode, we will review the action-packed weekend down in Brazil at the Interlagos circuit, and what an incredible weekend of Formula One racing it was. And oh boy, is there much to talk about. So let's just get right into it. The Brazilian Grand Prix played host to the penultimate race for the 2022 F1 season, as well as the last of 3 sprint race weekends for the year. So the action got started right away with traditional qualifying taking place on Friday instead of its usual place on Sunday. And I just have to say, I don't know about you guys, but it feels like this might have been the best qualifying of the entire season. The weather conditions were pretty much perfect for chaos, causing the teams to scramble for tire strategy with some getting it right, some getting it wrong. Let's just dive into it. We had a little bit of a wet Q1. I believe everyone started the first maybe 8-ish minutes on inters, with Gasly being the first one to risk it and go on softs, which didn't seem to work out for the first couple of laps, but then he figured it out and everyone went on softs. Matt, I know you've been hard on Ferrari this year. How bad did they screw up qualifying with their tire lack of decision making?
Royally. Like always. It's just what they do. The video of like Charles just sitting there in front, and then he's got green tires, and then it's just red, and he's just dumbfounded at their decision, and he ends up in 10th for the sprint race, which he probably would have been top 4, top 4 or 5 depending. So it cost them, at a minimum, in my opinion, 5 spots because of just another egregious mistake by their strategic team.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like first half of the season, they were notorious for making horrible decisions, and I feel like they've been a little bit better in the second half. Maybe that's because the spotlight hasn't been on them as much because Red Bull has been dominating. But yeah, the Q3 incident was the second tire sort of confusion of qualifying for Ferrari. If you remember back in Q1, Charles was just sitting there in his pit box, and they had no idea what tires to put on. I mean, they didn't have tires on the car. They couldn't decide whether it was red, green, softs, or intermediates. Just left him there. And he's like, come on, guys, like, what are we doing? And you could feel it, or at least I could on the broadcast, that they had no idea what to do.
I mean, they haven't had. You talked about that they haven't had any blunders. They haven't really been in a spot to make a blunder, though, right? They haven't been in a spot over these last handful of races where a decision has mattered. And when one finally does matter, they screw it up again. Good old Ferrari.
I feel like I'm never surprised by this. We called it a handful of podcasts ago how many more times they'll make mistakes, and they continue to make them. I would like to rewind for just a second and say how enjoyable having 3 days of racing in a row between qualifying and the sprint and the race. Just an awesome, exciting weekend down in Brazil. But yeah, no, not surprised by Ferrari whatsoever. That's pretty par for the course, and we'll get into how they rebounded later, but their indecisiveness has cost them more than just a championship. Charles, having the longest contract in Ferrari's history, he's got to be questioning that at this point with as many blunders as they have weekly.
Yeah, let's actually get into that for a minute, Cole, and we can continue the Ferrari bashing here in a second. But given that this was the last of the sprint weekends for this season, I believe there's supposed to be 6 in 2023. What do we think about the sprint weekend? I'll admit, coming into this weekend, I was a little indifferent on the sprint. I kind of felt like that it was too high risk and too low reward for there to actually be real racing in a sprint race, because at the end of the day, most of the points are rewarded on Sunday, not during the sprint. So sure, for us, the fans, we get to see an actual race versus, an extra practice session or, what is traditionally qualifying on Saturday. And there hasn't been that much drama on the sprint races. This sprint race weekend was pretty fantastic. I don't know if it was the combination of a fantastic qualifying and a pretty good or really good sprint race and an awesome race that kind of made the collective weekend incredible, like you said, Cole. But overall, how do you see the sprint weekend, and do you think they should change anything?
I love the sprint race. I think that I'm going to say it. It's good for the sport. It's fun for the sport. It's exciting for the sport. It's an extra day of racing. We love it. I don't care if they have accidents. It doesn't matter to me. I'm as a fan, which is all I care about. I'm excited for it. I'd like 12 of them next season, but 6 is great to start. We've talked about it. Same thing before. I wouldn't hate a reverse sprint. And just see what happens. I think we'll continue to do things a little out of the box that we have not done in years past, because they're trying to gauge what the entertainment value of each thing is going to be. So the sprint race seems to capture lots of excitement. So I would say continue to see those throughout the year. Maybe we'll get more, but I'm all in. I love the sprint race.
Yeah, so that's a little bit. I don't know if you guys saw this, but leading up to this weekend, Max came out and basically slammed F1 sprints. I think he said something along the lines of just not much happens, so what's the point? And there's been some discussions about maybe making a sprint sort of its own weekend, like its own event, not a part of a larger event. So, Matt, curious what your opinions are. I mean, do you like the way it is now, or is there anything you'd like to see different on a sprint weekend?
First, the track matters more than anything, in my opinion. It's such a short race that it needs to be on tracks that have a lot of overtaking opportunities, and you're not going multiple laps within a 24 lap race with nothing happening. Really, I mean, I love it. It's just an extra race, right? It's entertainment for us. It's just I know that it's just the rules, and I know we call qualifying on Friday qualifying, and put big ups to Magnussen for getting his first pole position, but then he's starting like 8th on Sunday or whatever it was. That's not the pole sitter at this point. Like that would be that's my only hang up, is like it just doesn't make any sense to me. Good for him. He qualified first for a race that qualifies you again. Just change the vernacular or something on that, but keep it as it is. It's great. It's fun. Have it at Brazil every single year, though.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think tracks obviously matter, and I'm sure they're trying to put it where there's a lot of opportunity for overtaking. I think they said there was 37 overtakes in the sprint race, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is awesome. I mean, after this weekend, and I know it's sort of fresh on all of our minds after watching it today, but give me 24 races at Interlagos. It's an awesome track. All 3 days of racing and qualifying were phenomenal. Lots of drama. But yeah, I mean, I coming into this weekend, I wasn't really sold personally on the sprint concept. Of course, I like more racing as a fan. But a part of me did agree with Max that there isn't a whole, because the risk is too high. I mean, what was it? Silverstone last year? Was that a sprint race where was that during the sprint race where Max and Lewis got into each other? Something happened that weekend that ended up, I think, causing a lot of people to be a little bit too conservative, if you will, and ultimately sort of tamped down the racing in a sprint race, which for us, we want to see real racing, which I feel like we got this weekend, which is good. But we'll see what they do in the future. I think there may be an opportunity to sort of take a different approach to it or a different look at it. I don't know if that's 2023 or 2024. But for this weekend, it was great. So getting back to qualifying, Matt, and I know you spoiled it a little bit, but not only did we have the Ferrari indecision, the conditions were, pretty crucial in terms of strategy. Do you go on softs? Do you go on inters? Q1 was a little bit of a mixed bag where they started on inters and they ultimately ended on slicks. Q2 was all on slicks, but at the beginning of Q3, to your point, Charles was the only one to come out of pit road or pit lane on inters, everyone else on slicks, because it seemed like there was a couple of minutes of gap before the rain fell down. And let's just say he wasn't too happy about it. We've got a little bit of audio from that.
The script just writes itself in Formula One. You gotta love it. Did everybody copy the like script? Yes, I did. Nice, beautiful.
Yeah, so clearly Charles none too happy with Ferrari's decision, and what made it even worse. And Cole, you can let us know a little bit about what happened here. Is that essentially everyone got 1 or maybe 2 laps on those soft tires before George beached it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Charles, the disappointment train, it just never stops, right? Just watching him leave pit lane with green stripes, he looked a little disappointed. They admitted post qualifying that it was a mistake. I don't disagree with the thought or the attempt to put him out on inters, because I mean, it did rain. It was spitting, so I don't think it was I bash on Ferrari a lot. I don't think it was the wrong decision. I think it was just exploring the track to see what they could figure out and realizing that it was not the correct move at that time. George beached it, but yeah, Charles should have qualified second or third if they didn't make that mistake.
So I don't. You're right that it had been spinning and it was raining, and you may not know what the track is after you sat in the garage for a little bit. So if that was the mistake, if that wasn't the mistake was that you had him go 2 laps with them. They had him
you also had his teammate on
around again.
Yeah, you also had his teammate on softs. So so what kind of you're going to put Carlos on softs with Charles on? I don't know if you're trying to hedge your bets there. It just didn't make sense.
Yeah, listen. If this was an American sport, like American type league sport, he'd be yelling to the media that Mattia needs to be fired. That's just what we do over here. So
yeah, he would have been fired.
Leclerc would be demanding into the media that he has a different coach at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it was just bizarre. There's a picture, and I know I put one up on our Instagram, where you could literally see, you could zoom in on Charles' eyes, and he's looking in his rearview mirrors, and he sees everybody else is on slicks. And, it's just the trend going around where it's like, he knows. It's like he knew he was in for trouble. And what made it even worse is that rain did come. I mean, first you had George beach it, which we can talk a little bit about that. He beached it, and there's a lot of conversation around if you cause a red flag during qualifying, should you be penalized or have your lap time deleted?
Yes.
Well, what do you think? You think so?
Yes. Well, I guess if you get the FIA involved, it's going to be tricky, because does it look like it was, on purpose? Did they, we'll talk later about Max and Checo purpose, Monaco, that kind of stuff. But if it looks like you purposefully beached it to keep your qualifying spot, then yeah, there should be some kind of penalty. But I mean, this has been happening for years and years with Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, right? Like, this has been going on for a long time. So it does get used to some people's advantage on purpose. And sometimes you get maybe lucky, like George just happened to, because he didn't mean to get stuck, obviously. But he did benefit from getting stuck when he did, based on the weather conditions. So kudos to him. He ended up obviously having a great race.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's not all qualifyings are equal. I think this scenario was a little bit unique. There's no way he did it intentionally. Yes, of course, he ultimately benefited by staying in P3, but they were also kind of tricky conditions. The track was getting wet. And so, yeah, I don't know what the appropriate sort of discipline is, probably not the right word, but to have his previous lap deleted just because he had an incident, I don't know. Maybe there should be a standardized, if you cause a red flag, you lose 3 grid places, something like that. I don't know, but it just seemed like there's a lot of people being like, well, George is the one that caused the red flag. He's the main beneficiary of it, and that's not right. So, ultimately what ended up happening is that the biggest beneficiary of all of that was Kevin Magnussen. So he happened to be, I think, actually in front of Leclerc on softs, and he got pole because after the red flag, it rained. There was no way anyone was going to beat that time because the track was wet. And we had not only Kevin Magnussen get his first career pole in Formula One, but it's the first ever pole in Formula One for Team Haas. So, Cole, you've got a Haas hat on right now. What are your emotions like right now?
I was so excited. I mean, if you watched qualifying, if you watched it live, there were a lot of great emotions that happened this weekend. Kevin Magnussen scoring his first pole in 141 races was pretty incredible. He looked so excited. He was a third on the longest streak for waiting for your pole. So waits for poles, the list goes right now. Number 1, longest wait, 216 races for Checo Perez. Number 2, 151 races for Carlos Sainz. And then it was number 3, K-Mag at 141. So he gets to break that streak. Pole position. He didn't do a lot with it, but that's not the point. Good for Haas, good for America, good for the sport. K-Mag is a GOAT.
Yeah, Matt, I think you had this stat recently or previously on another episode of our podcast, is that Kevin Magnussen has 1 career podium in his very first race. Now he has 1 career pole in his most recent race. So he's sandwiched the good things in his career by 39 races?
Good for him. The joy on his face, you didn't even, the helmet didn't need to be taken off to just see how elated he was sitting in that car waiting. And I was sitting there take your helmet off, after he's walking that whole stretch, and then just completely forgetting that he can't because he has to weigh himself with everything on. But what a moment for that guy. Good for him.
Everybody was excited for Kevin Magnussen. All the tweets and the posts, everything, every team congratulated K-Mag. People went out of their way to come up and say congratulations. It's a huge deal for him. It's a huge deal for Haas. And on the flip side, Mick Schumacher qualified 20th. So we went full sandwich. We pole and 20th. So another interesting stat that I saw, that K-Mag and Nico Hulkenberg, hopefully soon to be Haas driver, they both have poles at Brazil. I mean, neither of them obviously got a podium out of the deal, but potential 2 Haas drivers. But yeah, great for K-Mag, man. It really was a highlight of his career other than suck my balls, mate. Good stuff from K-Mag. So excited for him. Hopefully he gets to keep it up, and he and Nico are teammates next year with Haas.
That's the beautiful thing about sports, though, is there always seems to be stories like this that, I mean, I literally was in front of the TV like, oh my God. I was like, please rain, just because there was a Haas sitting on pole, which is just, I hadn't really thought about this till recently, is that we hadn't really had sort of that drama in qualifying. Of course, sure, was it Max? Was it Charles? Was it George got a pole? But it wasn't like the underdog, right? It wasn't like, Alonso wasn't up there. Or Lando, he was top 4, top 5 every now and then. But it wasn't like, oh my God, Latifi or Kevin Magnussen or Mick Schumacher is getting pole. And we finally got it. So I don't know if it was like the accumulation of that desire to have something crazy happen in this season of Formula One where, Max just ran away with it. And then it happened. And it was amazing. I mean, Matt, to your point, the pure joy in that entire paddock for Haas was unbelievable to watch. I mean, If you didn't get excited or didn't feel good about yourself or about what was happening, then there's something wrong with you, because that was awesome.
Yeah, if you love the sport, you thoroughly enjoyed K-Mag getting pole. If you didn't think that was incredible, turn the TV off. You're watching the wrong thing, because it was a moment for. It was like George getting back in Belgium last year in the rain, right? Like, it's one of those once in a lifetime that K-Mag will never get pole again. It'll never happen. But so we got to watch that. Was pretty incredible for K-Mag.
Yeah, I agree. And it was a pretty awesome, to your point earlier, Cole, about how there was 3 sort of immediate days of racing. It wasn't just practice on Friday. We jumped straight into qualifying on Friday, which is amazing. And moving into Saturday, the sprint race was also pretty good. I know we talked a little bit about, the sprint race in general. But for those who don't know, there was 3 sprint races this season, which is basically just, I don't know, it's basically like a 33% race. So 24 laps on Saturday to set the grid for Sunday's Brazilian Grand Prix. And I felt like overall it was a pretty solid sprint race. There was a lot of back and forth, at least early. I think everyone got the sense, Max took the lead, but then George and Lewis were right there, as well as Carlos, is that the Mercedes was looking real fast in Brazil, which is a little bit of spoiler for those that actually watched the race, and we know how that all ended. Well, I don't know what made the Mercedes come alive this week. There was even, chatter from Lewis and George that they didn't think they had a shot in Brazil, and they clearly had a shot. But let's talk a little bit about the drama. There was a few incidents on track. First, a lot of commentary, Cole, from Alonso about his boy Ocon. They had, I think, 2 different racing incidents. One, I think, was in turn 1, and another one was down the straightaway. And Alonso is 1,000% ready to move on.
Yeah, he's over it. He's the bank truck backing up to the house. He's got Strolovich money coming. He's made it very clear that he's looking to greener pastures on the other side, and he's just getting through. But he and Esteban, no love lost, kind of been brewing for the entire season, honestly. But a couple incidents, and I actually wish I had the audio of Fernando calling him, your friend. He seemed pretty upset about kind of how Esteban races him. Happens every week. Will continue to happen. Will happen next week. But the Alpines in the race ended up. We'll get to them later, but they ended up very strong. But yeah, no love lost between those two. Can't wait to see how Pierre matches up with Esteban next year, and how Fernando and Lance end up getting along. I mean, it's going to be full drama in 23. I'm so excited for it.
Yeah, and so, Matt, I don't know if you saw this, but, Alonso's radio call about being something along the lines of, "I damaged my front wing thanks to our friend," that was 100% Alonso's fault. I mean, he hit the back of him.
It was almost not the same thing, but with him and Stroll in Austin, he gets so close before he tries to pass out of that slipstream in DRS, and it's his fault. But pretty much 99% of the drivers, rarely is a guy behind the wheel saying it was their fault. So just
yeah,
how
but
they're wired.
We talked a little bit about this before the podcast. I just feel like between the Alonso stuff this weekend, and we'll get to the Max stuff, they both, to me, just come off like asses. And I know Alonso's got a reputation, and I appreciate and I love the driver that he is. But yeah, that was totally his fault. And then he comes out after the race, or after the sprint race, and is just thinking about, or saying things like, just one race left. Let's just get through Abu Dhabi and then it's over. Like, he is so ready to leave Alpine. It's not even funny.
Yeah, they haven't helped him. They haven't been. They've given him just an awful season over and over and over. Sten kind of put that together last, 2 weeks ago or whatever it may be on the pod. With how his teammates handled him, pit stops that go poorly. If Ferrari didn't have as many blunders as they've had this year, we'd be talking about the Fernando stuff a lot more than we have been. He's just I don't think it's just Ocon. I think he's just ready to not have his name attached to Alpine at this point.
He's one of the most unlucky drivers on the grid, though. I mean, if you look at his career statistically, he's got so many DNFs over the course of his career. He could be a 5-time world champion. He's a 2-time world champion, but he could be a 5-time world champion. Not at Alpine and won't be at Aston. But I think Fernando he's had the reputation of he's arrogant, he doesn't care, he's only out for himself, but people love him, and it's never going to change. That's how he is, that's who he is. He goes team to team, burning it down. He's an incredible driver, and I can't wait to see him in green. I can't wait. He did incredible for Alpine this year against Ocon. I can't wait to see him in green.
Yeah, I don't know if we have the stats in front of us, but I think his career DNF percentage is like 40 something percent. Like it's the highest in the hybrid, or maybe that's only in the hybrid era. But yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think it's interesting. And there's obviously a lot more behind the scenes, I'm sure, between either he and Ocon or just he and Alpine in general, which he's ready to see himself in green. He made that abundantly clear this past weekend. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if the grass is always greener on the other side. We'll see what happens when he gets to Aston Martin next year. But yeah, just a bit of a bizarre sort of situation between he and Ocon. They ultimately cost themselves a lot of positions in the sprint race, which I know, Matt, to your begrudging opinion, is how they form the grid for the race. I think they ended up starting 16th and 17th, which is not where you would think Alpine would start. They definitely made it up in the race today, which is great. But moving over to his soon-to-be team, I don't know what your opinion was of this, but I felt like Lance Stroll was trying to kill Seb Vettel. I mean, it's almost a carbon copy of the exact thing he did to Alonso in Austin at Coda. I mean, it was such a late move down the straightaway, forcing Seb on the grass. Truthfully, I don't know how Seb kept it straight. I fully expected like an airplane accident to happen, and thankfully it didn't. What the hell is Seb or is Lance doing in that situation?
He's driving his daddy's car. That's what he's doing. I mean, we give Latifi all the hate that he gets, but for some reason we skip over Stroll a little bit. I am on the full hate train for the Strollovich family. Other than the fact that Seb is there right now and Fernando is going there next year, I will continue to root for half of the team. But Lance Stroll does this, it seems like almost every week now. He just doesn't look in his mirrors. He didn't see you. He missed you somehow. But he will be the worst next year. I can't wait to hate on him. Like we did Latifi this year. He's the worst.
Yeah, we joke about Seb and how he's in the gravel a lot, so he knows how to get out of it. He knows that kind of stuff. I'm with you, Brady. When he got into the grass, I 100% thought that he was about to lose it. All that experience just allowed him to keep it straight. And then his reaction was perfect. We give hell to Fernando about his, my friend, and we'll get into some other comments later. But him just going, okay, was perfect. It was perfect.
He's got to be looking forward to being out of Aston. He's got to be, after all the experience he's had for so many years and so many winning teams, to go to Aston and to put up with the nonsense he's had to put up with Lance, he's got to be just over it. He's got to be over the Strollovich family.
100%. And who knows if that played into his decision to ultimately retire. But yeah, thankfully there wasn't an airplane crash and Seb was able to survive another laps in the sprint race. But yeah, I mean, lots of drama in the sprint race between teammates, which doesn't always happen, but maybe this year a little bit more so than others. And we'll get to even more teammate issues during the race. So just, putting a bow on the sprint race, like I said, overall, I thought it was pretty good. Your top three were George winning. So that was his first sort of win in Formula One. It wasn't a race, obviously, but we know what happened in the actual race today. Carlos finished P2, but had a 5 grid penalty, so ultimately ended up starting P7 in the race. And Lewis was P3. So for the first time all season, going into today's race, you had a Mercedes 1-2 front row lockout. And I think officially it looked like they were back. Leading into the race today, after the performance in the sprint race, you had a lot of people, even Max and Christian, saying Mercedes looks unbeatable. So Cole, what changed?
I mean, they've had a full season now of trying to sort it out. So I don't think they've had a front row lockout since maybe Imola of last year. I could be wrong, but something. So it's been a long time since they locked out the front row. They spent half the season trying to get the porpoising figured out, and then the other half of the season they're just playing catch up. So it does look like they're back, kind of at the end of the season, unfortunately. But I think that just carries us into what are they going to look like next year? How competitive are they going to be? What happens with Red Bull with the lost time in the wind tunnel? Yada yada yada. So yeah, I mean, I would say Mercedes look like the team of old the past 7-8 years. So great to see him back.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think back, to some of the conversations we had earlier this season. I know during summer break, we were all gung ho. We thought the Mercedes we saw today or the last couple of days in Brazil is who we thought maybe we'd see, in Spa, starting in Spa, and maybe the last, 9 races would just destroy everybody. And ultimately that didn't happen. But yeah, I think right now, after the last 72 hours, I mean, it was the first time watching Formula One this season. I was like, holy shit, Mercedes is definitely the best car. It wasn't this one hit wonder where, George randomly got pole in Hungary, or they kind of clipped the top of the timesheets, or, Lewis looked pretty fast in Spain. It was like, no, Mercedes is real. And unless there's, a change in conditions during the race, they looked like they were set up for a pretty good day. Which ultimately we know the results. So they did have a pretty good day. But to recap the race, starting off on lap 1, we had an early racing incident between Daniel Ricciardo and Kevin Magnussen. So unfortunately for K-Mag, as great as his Friday was, and he did finish P8 and score a point in the sprint race, his Sunday was relatively short. Danny Rick got into him, I think, on turn 6 or 7, and then he kind of was rolling backwards on the track, and they collided again, causing both Danny Rick and Kevin Magnussen to DNF. Definitely Danny Rick's fault. He's actually received a 3-place grid penalty for Abu Dhabi next week. So unfortunate for both of them to be out on the first lap, which caused an early safety car. And sort of the next drama that ultimately played out later in the race was a few laps after safety car on the restart. There's a little bit of chaos. Felt like this time last year when Max and Lewis were racing pretty closely and pretty heavily. And they got into each other in turn 2, which ultimately caused Max some damage on his front wing. And Lewis has to go on the runoff and fell back to, I think, P8 and have to fight his way back through the field in Brazil, which he did last year. Ultimately resulting in a 5-second penalty for Max. I know everyone, if you're a Max fan or a Lewis fan, is going to have your opinions on who's at fault here. Stewards had their opinion as well. Was this a racing incident or was this something else?
It was Max's fault. I did say it in our group message before the penalty was issued. 5-second penalty, Max will get it. He did. I mean, I can argue. You could argue both sides. I could understand Toto wanting to argue it. Max definitely over broke himself and late into 1. He came into 2, and they were close to side by side, but there was no room. Lewis didn't give an inch. Max didn't. He wasn't willing to back out at all. Obviously, they came together, and yeah, it could have been a racing incident, but I don't understand. We talk about it pre-podcast. I don't understand why those two always come together. When they're around each other, they find a way to come into each other. Lewis doesn't hit anybody else. Max doesn't really hit anybody, but when they're around each other, they always find each other.
Yeah, my opinion on that is I think they're each other's equals, or maybe they see each other as their equals, or who the other one strives to prove that they're better than, which maybe leads to a little bit more aggression. Matt, I know you're smirking here, but yeah, I mean, look, Max for the last couple of years has been chasing down Lewis and ultimately got him, winning back-to-back championships. And Lewis is arguably one of or the greatest of all time, wanting to kind of fend off the young gun. And yeah, they seem to, not much this year, but definitely last year, and at least today, were racing side by side and had a little bit of contact, which changed both of their races to some degree. Max ultimately went to the back, having to get a new wing and serve his 5-second penalty, and Lewis went on to P2. So yeah, it was, this time of the season, I don't know about you guys, I'm getting a little bit of PTSD and flashbacks to this time last year, where Lewis was charging through the field to ultimately win this race. We've got Abu Dhabi next week, which I know is still a sensitive subject to everybody. But yeah, Lewis came out after the race in his interview and basically said, it's Max, so it is what it is. So, Matt, I don't know if you want to defend Max here or Lewis here or what, but
I don't know. I don't know if I would, necessarily defend Max. I mean, I think there's always this point of contention where we've got to blame somebody. It's always somebody's fault, and rarely is ever anything 50-50, but I mean, if it didn't really ruin anybody's race, and maybe it's 55-45 or 60-40, and when you're at that point, to me, it's probably more than a racing incident than a 5-second penalty. Stewards obviously saw it a different way. I agree with y'all that, Max, how he handled it and broke late kind of caused it. That was the cause and then the effect, not really who was ahead or who was not. But at some point you got to let guys battle, and if you're going to penalize 5 seconds for something like that, to me, you're going to de-emphasize battling. I will say the reason they got close, and this was my opinion, is, and maybe this is, Charles left Lewis as a sitting duck on that restart because he backed everybody up so far, and that Red Bull gets such a good jump on that straight that he didn't do it on the second one. If you notice on the second restart, he starts gunning it up the hill, where on the first one, he sits back and backs everybody up. And then when he goes, the Red Bulls are able to catch Lewis fairly quickly into that first turn. Now, that may just be me on that point, and it is what it is, but I think if he handles it like he did the second one, they're not even close to touching each other. But that's just me on that portion of it. Not that George is at fault.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, it was a situation where Lewis was 100% leading into the braking zone in turn one, and he covered the inside, which is what I guess you should do in that situation. And Max blew through the braking zone, got ahead of him because he wasn't braking for a split second. And then by the time they made the turn, Lewis was in front and Lewis squeezed him. And, I don't know. I don't think this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but Max isn't going to give up in that situation, unlike other drivers who may have backed out. So Cole, to your question earlier, I mean, Max might be the only one in that situation who's just going to keep trying, where a lot of other people might just back out and, live to survive another day. Max isn't doing that. I mean, for me, Max bullies people off the track all the time. So he would do exactly what Lewis did in that situation, which shouldn't surprise Max. I guess, sometimes people don't like getting a taste of their own medicine. Yeah, I mean, look, I think Max got the penalty for it. So the FIA has their opinion. Max ultimately suffered the bigger damage there, literally and figuratively. He had to go in for a new wing and serve his penalty. So, that moved Max down to the back of the field, which, since he's already won the championship in a way is kind of good for drama. And now you've got George and Checo and Lewis and Carlos all, fighting for, a win here, which was good because we haven't seen a lot of that. And so, in my opinion, the middle laps, kind of maybe the middle half of the race, There wasn't a whole lot of drama. A lot of pitch strategy in play where, Lewis went a little bit long on his stint in the softs to try to cover Checo and all this back and forth. Carlos pit early and was on fire. He was setting a lot of lap times. They were trying to figure out if they had a gap to sort of see, how those podium places were going to play out. But then we got a safety car on lap 52, I believe, Lando DNF. He had been reporting an issue throughout the race, I think a steering lock issue, but ultimately had a power failure on lap 52, causing a virtual safety car at first, and then ultimately a full safety car, which allowed Carlos actually to get a little bit of advantage on the pit stop. But Cole, we've beat up the FIA repeatedly on this podcast, and I think deservedly so. That safety car took like 8 laps.
It was ridiculous. It shouldn't take that long to clear out a car. I mean, even the VSC he had an electrical problem. He didn't smash it into bits. There wasn't carbon fiber all over the track. Literally put it in neutral and roll that thing off the track. What are we doing here? It took him at least 8 laps. So I don't understand what took so long. They do it. It seems like almost every race, I'm blown away at how long it takes to clear a car. Not an accident, not rebuild the wall, just move the car off the track. So yeah, it took way too long. But poor Landy, hated it for him on his birthday. Shout out, happy birthday, Landy Norris, 23. Yeah, bad day for McLaren. But yeah, way too long on the safety car. It should take 3 laps. 3 laps or red flag it. What are we doing?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys caught this, but they were talking about on the broadcast how they should just get a couple marshals out there and push it, out of the way, because he had kind of pulled off but couldn't get all the way there. But then like a lap or two later, you see them like pushing him back up the hill, like, oh shit, we went the wrong way. So yeah, I mean, it took a long time, but it reset the field, which sometimes is always fun for a little last, 8 or 9 lap shootout. And so yeah, we reshuffled the field. You had George leading as he had been for pretty much the whole race. Followed by 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, followed by Carlos Sainz on fresher tires, soft tires. Checo was in P4 on mediums, which ultimately hurt him in the long run. And then even Max was kind of in play, and Charles. We kind of skipped over it, but sort of the other incident that didn't lead to a safety car is that Lando, before his DNF, hit Charles. Charles spun, hit the wall, somehow kept it going. So yeah, it was kind of a fun, in the world of Formula One, sometimes the races, if there's no safety car, especially no late safety car, can be a little bit, I don't want to say boring, but you kind of know what's going to happen unless there's a strategy issue or something like that. But you had basically a 9-lap shootout. And I don't know about you guys, but I really thought Lewis was gonna get it. I really thought, you heard George come over the radio asking if they were going to race or if they were going to secure the 1-2, and the orders from Mercedes was, you guys can race. So I don't know if that was George being like, dang, I've got Lewis Hamilton behind me, and I've got 9 or 10 laps left in this race. The guy's awesome in Brazil. How am I going to do this? But as we saw, George did great.
He sounded a little dejected. He on the radio when they came over and said, you're free to race, within reason, right? Keep it clean, keep it nice, but you're free to race. He did kind of sound like he was hoping that they would just say, oh yeah, we've radioed Lewis 1-2, he'll back you up, he's good to go. So he sounded a little concerned for just that. I mean, obviously he did fine, but I think he was hoping that the team was going to say, yes, we'll secure 1-2. You just run your race, you're good to go.
Yeah, so Matt, I know you've had some opinions on George Russell the last couple of weeks, but he ultimately went on to hold off Lewis Hamilton. Lewis actually never got within DRS, and George Russell, first career win in Formula One.
Yeah, pumped for George. I mean, I have said multiple times that I think Lewis has been the best driver on that team over the last half of the season, and George went to a track that Lewis likes very much and won the sprint race and then wins the Grand Prix. And not only wins the Grand Prix, he holds off Lewis for the win, which, in my opinion, I get he would have loved to have that secured win with them saying, team orders and not your free to race, but it's got to be more satisfying to win as you're free to race than it is just given to you essentially. And so, I mean, he looked great. The emotions he had afterwards, his first ever win. He was the best driver on the track. He deserved it very much. And as much as I would have kind of liked to see Lewis's streak continue of wins every season, he still got one more shot. But seeing George get his first one, which everybody thought was going to happen 20 races ago, right? Finally getting it done. Good for him. Good for Mercedes.
Yeah, I'm sure we and he expected to win much earlier this season than they did. But yeah, I mean, I think it was Toto who came out last week and said he'd rather get a win this season than finish P2 in the constructors, and they've gotten the win. I think they're going to be a little bit too far out to get second in the constructors, but yeah, I mean, I'm pumped for George. I think you saw the raw emotion come out of him when he won. I mean, I think he came over the radio and said, "Guys, I'm in tears," like before he got out of the car, which you love to see. I mean, the guy sat in a Williams, which is the worst car on the grid for 3 years, and had his moments where either in Bahrain when he was filling in for Lewis for COVID should have won that race and didn't, or when he's in P10 and didn't he like bite it during a safety car or something crazy? Like he had his moments where he just was trying to score a point for Williams or trying to get that win and prove that he is like the next generation of great drivers. And yeah, I mean, 1 or 2 races into this season, he finally gets it done. He was elated. I'm elated for him. I'm pumped the Mercedes seems to be back. Going 1-2 and looking pretty dominant was, I thought it might have happened like 9 races ago, and it didn't. So you kind of thought you would never see it in 2022, but here we are. Mercedes 1, Mercedes 2.
I do also want to make a point for anybody who wants to go and see what a team looks like. Go watch the end of this race with how Mercedes and Lewis celebrated George versus how Ferrari celebrated Carlos Sainz. Just
what happened? I missed that. What happened?
No, just when nobody was happy for him. Like when they had wasn't a McLaren guy there for him. There was one McLaren guy and 6 Ferrari guys earlier in the season. So
Carlos always feels disrespected. That's just kind of how it goes with his role in Ferrari. But overall, exciting for George, yes. So between having K-Mag on pole and George getting a win, does it get, other than Abu Dhabi last year, right, with the controversy, does it get more exciting than having a first-time pole sitter and a first-time winner of the weekend? I don't think it does. That's really as good as it's going to get, other than Abu Dhabi final race, final lap, championship shootout. So great to see K-Mag. Incredible to see George. Happy to see him emotional. He's come a long way in Formula One, right? From starting with a PowerPoint presentation, pleading for Toto to get a role on the team when he was hardly a teenager, to being his hero or his idol's teammate, to winning his first race and potentially beating Lewis his first year in points overall, which would be incredible.
Yeah, it looks like that's going to happen. George has a 25-point lead. So unless Lewis wins and gets fastest lap in Abu Dhabi and George DNFs, George will beat him this year. So yeah, I think Mercedes made the right choice, putting George in that seat. He hasn't been perfect. He certainly made his mistakes. He certainly has blamed other people for his own incidents, which, happens from time to time, but, happy and excited to see him and ultimately Mercedes win. I think this is going to give them a ton of momentum, not only for Abu Dhabi, but going into 2023. And, with the penalties coming Red Bull's way due to the cost cap, I think Mercedes is ready to just crush it in 2023. One last comment, Cole, just to go back to what you said between Sainz and Charles. how about Charles' radio call asking, think about the championship, and ultimately asking Ferrari to swap places with Carlos?
Come on. Carlos raced his D off for that podium position. You can't swap those spots. He made the call a couple different times. But no, Ferrari pretty much just kind of ignored it. And, Carlos could have been driver of the day. But yeah, Charles asking for positions at the end after Carlos raced as hard as he did. I understand that flip if you're in, 9, 10, 7, 8, somewhere in there. But, Carlos deserves that podium. So, yeah, shame on him for asking.
I agree. I mean, you even heard him on the broadcast be like, not for a podium. If it was 5th and 6th, 7th and 8th, sure. Maybe you swap places, but not for a podium. Carlos was great today. I mean, and Charles was pretty great too. I mean, the recovery that he had from, obviously he started P10 yesterday in the sprint race because of the qualifying issues that we talked about with the wrong tire. He made up for it and ultimately finished P4, which is a great showing for Ferrari. Speaking of bad teammates and position swaps, we certainly couldn't end this episode without talking about the chaos that ensued between Max and Checo. To reset a little bit, when the safety car ended with about 8 or 9 laps to go, Checo was running, I believe, in P3 or P4, but he was the only one on mediums. So he got swallowed up pretty early by Carlos, by Charles, and was cruising in 5th place. And then you have Max Verstappen behind him. And the radio calls I thought were interesting because, Checo obviously is trying to fight for 2nd place overall in the Drivers' Championship for this season. Max has won the championship. Red Bull has won the championship. So there's literally no value in getting Max more points. But they told Max basically to go take points off of Charles and Carlos. Forget who it was. Alonso. It was Alonso and Charles. And basically told him to go past Checo. Which just felt like in that was the first moment that just kind of felt wrong. Like there's literally nothing to gain for Max doing that. And so what ultimately ended up happening is Max passed Checo. And there was another radio call that ensued a few laps later that said, don't worry, we will invert the positions if Max doesn't move ahead on the last lap. So we have some radio about what happened.
Max, let Checo through, please. Max, what happened? I told you already last time. You guys don't ask that again to me. Okay? Are we clear about that? I gave my reasons, and I stand by it.
Yes, if you couldn't tell through that, Max did not give the position back to Checo. And in my opinion, gave his whole team a big old middle finger. And that radio call to me, if it wasn't clear already, Max is definitely the leader of that team. I don't know what happened behind closed doors. I don't know what his reasons were. There's some rumors about what happened with Checo and Monaco and maybe intentionally crashing. But what do we make of this? I mean, does Max just come off looking like an asshole here, or what's the deal?
He's got the golden boots. I mean, that carries a lot of weight. He's clearly the number one driver favorite. He's the golden child. So, yeah, he comes off looking terribly by not giving Checo the position. I mean, Checo's tied for. He and Charles are tied for 2nd going into the final race. So, if he gave up the position, I mean, Checo would have had the lead. Same with Charles asking to invert he and Carlos, but still, shame. I like Max, but shame on Max for acting that way because he would only be a one-time world champion if it wasn't for Sergio Perez, but he may not be any world champion if it wasn't for Checo. Checo's done so much for Max. The past 2 seasons that he's had, the fact that he wouldn't give back one position, I understand where Max is coming from, that this is racing and you earn it on the track. But in the position that he's in, he absolutely could have helped Sergio out. And he said in Abu Dhabi, if it comes available again, he will help Checo. He will help him. But for some reason, he didn't this week. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I'm kind of at a shame on Max right now.
Yeah, so we have a little bit of radio from Checo and his reaction to not letting or not being allowed to take his position back.
Okay, so Max will let you through. Yeah. Thank you for that, guys. Thank you.
I'm sorry about that, Checo.
Yeah, it shows who he really is. Don't know what to say, Checo.
Yeah, I mean, to hear Checo's comments, and Matt, I'm curious of your thoughts on this. I mean, he came out and he said it shows who he really is. Is that just a heat of the moment kind of thing, or is that a sign of something else is brewing underneath or behind closed doors with Red Bull?
I think from a media standpoint, from a fan perspective, people have or kind of complain about how Max handles himself on the track and then his interviews afterwards or whatever it may be. So I think people are going to read into that as even his own teammate sees it that way to an extent. I think it's a little bit of both. I'm sure Checo probably wishes he had not said that over a public radio for everybody to hear. But I do also think that there is some truth and intent to what he said. And now this is going and starting from a team who has a driver's championship, who has a constructor's championship, both wrapped up, could be 1 and 2 in the driver's championship, going into an offseason where they have now created drama for themselves for a team who refuses to do Drive to Survive because they don't want drama, right? So now they have literally caused it themselves with 2 races to go, all because of one position, and they've shot themselves in the foot. It's not like there's one more race, right? But that race doesn't matter. There's not going to be this whole off season of just what's wrong inside the Red Bull paddock and the Red Bull team. There's nothing but drama that can be stirred up, and it's all because of what they did in that last lap. And Brady, you mentioned some people don't like to get the taste of their own medicine, but they're about to kind of get it themselves right now.
But that's what's crazy to me. I mean, an entire meme was created about Checo, a good meme. Meme maybe isn't the right word, about the Minister of Defense because of what he did multiple times, and especially in Abu last year, for Max Verstappen. I mean, if you remember, we're going to relive this for the next week with all the highlights of what happened in Abu Dhabi. But before the whole safety car, last lap fiasco, what have you, Checo had a phenomenal defense of Lewis that ultimately let, I think, Max back in the race by like 10 seconds. And so we've come a long way from Max's radio call basically being like, Checo, you're a legend, to basically being like, F you, I'm not giving this position back. So I don't know what has gone on behind closed doors. There's a lot of rumors floating around today that maybe Checo admitted that he wrecked in Monaco on purpose, causing a red flag to secure pole, and Max is still unhappy about it. But whatever it is, I think we found Checo's real opinion of Max out today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of read from what Max. It seems like Max expects a lot and will give little. And if that is what Checo means by that, we see who he truly is. And don't get me wrong, the Monaco thing is kind of shady. If that is true, and it seems to be true from reports, then this little side story has come out now all of a sudden because of this, which is funny. But should that be the reason? Like, after what he's done for you, you can't forgive that minor incident to this point? Like, it just, like, again, he expects a lot and he's going to give little for any transgression.
The races last year that Checo helped Max: Monaco, Baku, France, Silverstone, Turkey, Austin, Brazil, and Abu Dhabi. Those are all just a quick glance at Checo going out of his way to be a good teammate, team member, team player. Max does not return the favor. But again, I'm not surprised. It's Max. It's how he is. It's just how it's going to be. But yeah, multiple times Checo goes above and beyond to help the team.
I mean, we talk about Abu and what happened in Max winning and this and that. Jordan, just I don't know how many points that was, but from those 7 to 8 races that you just listed, Abu may not have mattered if he wasn't the teammate.
Max is missing a world championship if you take Checo off that team, for sure. At least one, maybe two.
Which is also 100%. I could not agree more with that. On the Monaco point, I mean, if Checo wrecked intentionally, obviously that's a problem. But that was a long time ago, and ultimately, in hindsight, had zero bearing on this championship. So why Max is still holding that grudge just seems like, how did you not already bury that hatchet internally behind closed doors as a team? And now all of this grievance is being aired out in the public is not good. It's not good for them. I mean, Red Bull obviously had their fair share of drama between Abu Dhabi, between cost cap, and now this. The Christian Horner is probably just looking in the mirror being like, what the hell, guys? Like, what just happened?
I mean, we've said it for a while, and it shows last year. I mean, Max has, do you want to say it's anger issues or whatever it may be? He gets really heated. It runs in the family. But it's costing Red Bull going forward, and we'll see how it pans out over the offseason.
Yeah, so look, to put a bow on the episode in Brazil, phenomenal week. Lots of highs, lots of lows, lots of drama. Kudos to Mercedes for going 1-2. Kudos to George for getting his first career win. Kudos to Kevin Magnussen for getting his first career pole. Thank you to Fernando and Esteban for providing drama. Thank you to, I don't want to say Stroll and Seb provided. It wasn't really drama for almost providing an airplane crash. We'll see what ultimately happens between Max and Sergio, and hopefully they, cooler heads will prevail, and ultimately Max will be a good teammate in Abu. But yeah, lots went on this past weekend in Formula One.
And speaking of Abu, don't forget F2's final 2 races next week. We will find out if Logan Sargent gets his super license points next week and can jump in to the Williams car next year.
And if he doesn't, the rumor is that Mick Schumacher may ride over to Williams. We'll see what happens with Logan Sargent, but that's the rumor.
Yeah, so we should be able to put that to bed in the next week also. I think it sounds like Haas is going to announce what we think is Nico this week. We thought it was last week, but they've said for sure they will announce it maybe leading up to Abu. So we'll know Mick's future here pretty soon, whether that's Haas or whether that's Williams. I'm sad to say that next week in Abu Dhabi is the last race of the season. But as always, we got you covered with Formula One content. Be sure to check us out on social media at the Slipstream F1 Pod. Give us a like, give us a listen, give us a follow, give us questions. We appreciate you guys reaching out, listening, tuning in. So as always, we'll catch you next week. Peace.